Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us on this chilly evening. Yeah, warm welcome to you all. We, as always, really appreciate our communities and our fellow river advocates. Um, yeah, and really does make a huge difference to have this sense of a movement coming together and all moving in the same direction towards long-term river health. So, Friends of the Dart, if you're not familiar with our work, we exist to advocate for the River Dart. We do this through evidence-based advocacy and collaborative working, focusing on minimizing pollution and empowering our communities. Um, our water quality testing program has evolved enormously since we began in 2022. We began with teams of volunteers on locations in the river at 7 locations. We now have Eliza, who's our water technician, and we've developed a really comprehensive peer-reviewed testing protocol that creates evidence to give accountability and transparency. Other aspects of the project to support river health are using our voice towards updating policy nationally. We are also mentoring and connecting with other river groups through and with best practice leadership and our emerging regional plans, which are very exciting. And we have an ambassador project that we are working towards, which will see river ambassadors who are really informed about water quality and ways that they can support their local environment as parish by parish. So there'll be ambassadors in each parish along the whole of the river. So yeah, it's an amazing project, and I am personally very, very pleased to be part of it. And I'm pleased that you're here with us. So we have in the room Eliza, who is our water technician, and Rob, who is one of our directors, who is our data lead, myself, who's the director, and Nikki, who'll be joining us at some point, who's a director. So we have 3 directors, Eliza, we have Caitlin Marie, who is our amazing communications person, and Charlotte, who works with us, supporting us in evidencing the benefit of what we're doing and making sure that we're reporting effectively on on our outcomes, and also in fundraising. So now I will hand over to Eliza, who will overview our findings from phase 3 and of our water quality testing program, and introduce this next phase, which is phase 4. If you have any questions, as Rob said, please do add them to the chat. There'll also be a chance at the end of the presentation to ask questions in person. So to do that, in order to do that, you just put your hand up, you press at the bottom, there's an option to raise your hand, and we'll come to you in turn. So yes, over to you, Eliza.
All right, thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. So I am Eliza. I'm the water technician with Friends of the Dart, and I will be talking today about what we've been doing for the past year as our phase 3 water quality monitoring program, and then how we've used this data that we've gathered to inform what we'll be doing for the coming year for 2026. So, as Hannah mentioned, at the start of the project, we were monitoring 7 sites across the main river, and these helped us understand the patterns of water quality that we were seeing as we moved from Holne Weir on Dartmoor down to the mouth of the river in Dartmouth. And so this really highlighted for us the areas of the river where we wanted to focus our monitoring work to understand why we were seeing this pattern of water quality deteriorating as you move down towards Dartington and Totnes. And so we built our phase 3 monitoring network to build a catchment-wide baseline of the water quality within the catchment. So we wanted to move, in addition to the main river sites, to start monitoring some of the key tributaries feeding into the river, particularly between Buckfastleigh and down to the River Harborne that feeds into Bow Creek. And these tributaries haven't been monitored in the past. And so there was a real gap in our knowledge as to the levels of pollution that these tributaries were contributing to the main river. So by building this catchment-wide baseline, we hoped to understand the differences between these key tributaries and also to be able to distinguish between rainfall-driven spikes in pollution versus persistent background pollution. So when we have these rainfall events, the river systems there's greater pressure placed on them because we very often see spills from combined sewage overflows, which are basically pipes connected to the sewage network. And when you have these high levels of rain entering into the system, they begin to spill, and it will be this mixture of rainfall and also sewage coming from the sewage treatment work, which will then be entering into our rivers. And this is to prevent the system backing up back into our drains. But it obviously means when these CSOs are spilling that we're seeing a lot of fecal pollution entering into the system. So we wanted to gather data to understand how these water systems were responding to rainfall events, but also to understand what the background levels of pollution looked like. So when we don't have these rainfall events, what does water quality look like across the catchment? And by gathering this data, it would help us to identify where further investigation would deliver the most benefit. So how did we do this testing in 2025? We were measuring E. coli, which is a bacterial species, and it's called a fecal indicator organism. So that means that the presence of E. coli in water samples and in the water indicates recent fecal contamination. So this fecal contamination could be coming in from sewage treatment works. It could also be coming in from agricultural runoff. So picking up any fecal matter that is on agricultural land. So that could be animal manure or fertilizers that have been spread. And it will also pick up road runoff coming through more urban areas. And so whilst it doesn't distinguish between the sources of pollution, understanding the levels of E. coli within the water helps us understand the levels of fecal pollution that are entering into the water. And so throughout 2025, we were monitoring E. coli levels across 30 sites in the catchment. And we were monitoring these under both dry weather conditions so that we could collect a really strong data set to understand the baseline levels of pollution. But we were also collecting weather samples after wet weather events, so after rainfall, so that we could see how these water systems were responding to rainfall events across the catchment. And as of 2025, we started using Petri films to monitor E. coli. So the photo on the right shows the Petri film plates, and they are basically plates that contain a growth medium that allows any E. coli within the water sample to grow on the plate, and it will grow into a colony that you can see on the plates here as a blue-green dot. So each of those dots are E. coli colonies. And so I'll go out into the field, I'll collect samples from the sites, and then take them to our in-house lab in Dartington. And 1 milliliter of each sample goes onto the Petri film plates, and they get incubated for 24 hours. And then I'll come back in and count the blue-green dots on the plate, and the number of blue-green dots on the plate can be used to calculate the concentration or the amount of E. coli that was in the water sample. And Petri films have proven to be an invaluable tool for us because they've enabled us to monitor E. coli levels across the catchment on a much wider scale than we were able to do when we were conducting lab testing. So where previously we were monitoring 7 sites, we're now monitoring 30 sites across the catchment. So it's enabled us to create this really catchment-wide understanding of water quality within the catchment. And the Petri films are also a lot quicker than the traditional lab results. So we get the results back within 24 hours compared to upwards of 48 hours for the traditional lab testing. So I'll talk quickly about the findings that we've gained this year on our main river sites. So starting with Holne Weir, which is up on Dartmoor near to Spitwick, and it's a really popular site for river users. So a lot of people use it for swimming and kayaking, stand-up paddleboarding, etc. So the data that we've collected on Holne Weir has shown that overall water quality is good here. And if we look at some of the statistics below in the slide, we can see that the mean or the average level of E. coli within the water is 188 CFU per 100 mils. CFU per 100 mils means colony forming units per 100 mils, and that's the standard unit measurement for E. coli concentration within the water. So we're seeing a low mean E. coli concentration here. And if we look below to the 95th percentile value, so the 95th percentile is basically the value at which 95% of the samples sit below. So for this data set on Holne Weir, the 95th percentile is 506. And if we then look at the table on the right, which are the thresholds used by the Environment Agency to classify the water quality at bathing waters, highlighted in blue is the threshold for non-tidal sites for excellent compared to good. So as you can see there, for a site to be considered excellent, the 95th percentile needs to sit at or under 500. And for Holne Weir, we found that it sits at 506. So it's just above the threshold for excellent, putting it into good. But overall, the message is that water quality at Holne Weir was very good. So moving on now to Dartington Beach. This year, considering the data that we've collected, the overall water quality here that we found is poor. And the patterns that we saw throughout the year monitoring were a combination of summer dry weather spikes. So we saw these elevated levels of E. coli at Dartington Beach in the summer. And this tends to be associated with the dry weather that we had over the summer. So it was a particularly dry summer. There was very little rainfall. And that meant that the flow of the river was a lot lower. So when you had these pollution events occurring, there was much less dilution of bacteria within the water. And so that could be driving these dry weather spikes that we saw at Dartington Beach. But the data also shows us that there were additional rainfall-driven spikes. So that shows that this is a part of the river that is also influenced by wet weather events, and that this is also driving E. coli levels to be higher. So if we take a quick look at the statistics for this site, the average or mean E. coli level was at 1,997, and the 90th percentile, which is the value at which 90% of the samples sit under, is at 4,760. And circled in the box on the table is the threshold value at which any non-tidal site would be considered poor using the 90th percentile. So as you can see, for a site to be considered poor, the 90th percentile would be above 1,000. And here we're seeing 4,760. So this is showing that the data that we've gained on Dartington Beach shows that this is sitting well within the threshold for poor water quality. It's a similar pattern at Dartington Pontoon. So again, overall, our data suggests that this site had poor water quality throughout the year. This doesn't mean that every individual sample was poor, but considering the thresholds that the Environment Agency uses to categorise bathing waters, this is a site that would be considered poor. And again, we see this pattern of summer dry weather spikes with additional rainfall-driven spikes, so very similar to Dartington Beach. Looking at the statistics, the average here, the average E. coli concentration was 1,392. So it's elevated, but it is lower than Dartington Beach. And that likely represents the dilution of pollution events as you move down the river. So the bacteria within the water is diluting as you move downstream. But still at this site, we see a 90th percentile value of 2,740, which again is sitting well in the threshold for poor, which would be anything above 1,000. So now we move on to Steamer Key, which is one of the designated bathing sites. So this means that the Environment Agency has been monitoring Steamer Key throughout the bathing season, which runs from the middle of May until September. And they were taking regular samples and analysing them for bacteria. And then at Friends of the Dart, we've been supplementing that with testing outside of the bathing season to enable us to have a year-round data set, which we feel more accurately represents the usage of the river because members of the community are interacting with the river year round, and also for all of the organisms living in or on the river, water quality year round matters, not just within the bathing season. So our monitoring of Steamer Key outside of the bathing season is filling that current knowledge gap that we have. So at Steamer Key, again, overall, the statistics suggest that water quality here was poor. And this is in agreement with the Environment Agency's classification of Steamer Key as poor for the most recent bathing season in 2025. And again in 2024, it was also categorised as poor. So it seems to be a site that is consistently struggling, and there are consistent pressures being placed on this section of the river, which is driving this poor water quality. And the data at Steamer Key shows that we were seeing dry and wet weather spikes here. So we were seeing high levels of E. coli under dry weather conditions and also after rainfall. And the average value, the average E. coli concentration here was 2,911. So a lot higher than we saw at Dartington Beach and Dartington Pontoon. And similarly, the 90th percentile sat at 7,450. And if we look at the table on the right, we've now moved to the tidal site thresholds. So the thresholds for to categorize water quality are different for tidal sites versus non-tidal sites. And as you can see here, the threshold values for tidal sites are lower than for non-tidal. So for a tidal site to be considered sufficient, the 90th percentile needs to be 500 or less. And what we're seeing here at Steamer Key is a 90th percentile of 7,450, which really amplifies the struggle that this site is facing in terms of water quality. Moving on now to Stoke Gabriel. So this is another designated bathing site. The data that we've collected to date on this site suggests that it is overall poor in water quality. And again, this is in agreement with the Environment Agency, who classified Stoke Gabriel in 2025 as poor. It was sufficient in 2024, so it's now gone down to poor. And the data that we have on the Stoke Gabriel bathing site shows evidence largely of rainfall-driven spikes. So we're seeing these big spikes in E. coli, which means big spikes in fecal pollution after these wet weather events. Taking a look at the average E. coli concentration here, it's 586. So that is lower than we've seen at Steamer Key, but the 90th percentile here is at 2,180. So again, this is well into the threshold for poor. So moving on now to Dittisham. Our data that we've collected across the year at Dittisham suggests, again, a poor classification overall. But if we take a look at the 90th percentile value, it sits at 620. And looking at the table, anything at or under 500 would be considered sufficient. So it's just at that threshold for sufficient. It's just above it and pushing it into the poor. But looking at the mean, it sits at 244. So we've got a lower mean here, which suggests that we're seeing some remote spikes in E. coli, but overall water quality is okay here. It's worth noting here that the Environment Agency classified Dittisham as excellent this bathing season, and the differences in our findings likely reflect the fact that our data is year-round. So we're looking at water quality throughout the year, whereas the Environment Agency is just looking at the months between May and September, where we often see water quality improving, because in these winter months we see a lot more wet weather events, which are then bringing more fecal pollution into the river. And it's a similar story at Warfleet Creek, which is the designated bathing site in Dartmouth. So again, looking at the statistics for our data, it suggests an overall classification of poor, but again, it's sitting very, very close to the threshold for sufficient. So the 90th percentile here is 563, and anything at or below 500 would be considered sufficient. So it's just over. And we do see a lower average E. coli concentration here. Again, the Environment Agency classified this site as excellent in the most recent bathing season in 2025. So our data likely reflects the year-round testing that we're conducting, showing that whilst during the bathing season water quality may be excellent, we do see this deterioration outside of the bathing season in the winter months. So to take a step back now from the main river findings and the patterns of water quality as we move down the river, we're looking here at the tributaries feeding into the River Dart that we have been monitoring alongside other organisations and research groups. So many of these tributaries highlighted on the map in blue are tributaries that we began monitoring in phase 3, with the addition of the Bidwell Brook, which is being monitored by a research group from the University of Plymouth in collaboration with Melenditech and also the Bidwell Brook Partnership. And we also have at the very bottom on the right, the Yalberton stream, which feeds into the Millpool in Stoke Gabriel. And that was monitored by the Environment Agency last bathing season. But the other tributaries highlighted here are all ones that we focused our testing on for the past year. And considering the data overall, what this has shown is that we found evidence of elevated E. coli concentrations across the board. That's not every single sample, but we have seen these spikes in E. coli in every tributary that we've monitored. But we're also seeing this really big variability between the tributaries. So we're seeing some tributaries that, when we consider the year-round data, some that are much more affected by these rainfall-driven spikes, but whose baseline levels of E. coli under dry weather are much lower, whereas others that, whether it's dry or wet weather, have these elevated E. coli levels with more pronounced spikes under wet weather, but still elevated levels under dry weather. We're seeing this evidence of more persistent pollution. So not just pollution associated with rainfall events, such as spills from combined sewage overflows and the sewage network, as well as runoff, but persistent sources of pollution affecting these systems. So I'll talk first about the rainfall-driven systems that our data evidences. So as I mentioned, these are the ones whose baseline levels of E. coli are lower, suggesting limited fecal inputs under dry weather conditions. But these are tributaries where we see these big spikes following rainfall events. So some examples of these are the Ashburn and Mardle rivers, which feed into Buckfast Lee, the Old Road tributaries, which it's 3 separate tributaries that sit along the old Totnes to Buckfast Lee Road, the Old Mill Leat, which feeds into the River Dart near Staverton Station, and the River Harborne, which feeds into the Bow Creek. And so these are tributaries where our data suggests lower dry weather concentrations of E. coli, which suggests lower fecal inputs under dry weather. But as I mentioned, these rainfall associated spikes, which suggests a link here to combined sewage overflow spills and runoff in these systems. But our data has created evidence that other tributaries within the Dart catchment have persistent baseline pollution. So these are where we're seeing these elevated E. coli levels even in dry weather. Examples of these are the Malt Mill Lake, which feeds into Totnes, downstream of Totnes Weir, but upstream of Steamer Quay, as well as the River Hems, which is fed by the Ambrook tributary. This runs through villages such as Broadhempston, Torbryan, Denbury, and then flows through Little Hempston and joins the main river upstream of Steamer Quay. In addition to that, the data on Yalberton Stream that we've gained access to from the Environment Agency suggests a similar pattern of persistent baseline pollution under dry weather alongside these wet weather spikes. So where we see data like this, it's suggestive of point sources of fecal pollution. So a point source of pollution could be something like a pipe misconnection, which is where a foul water line, which is carrying sewage from houses, is mistakenly connected into surface water lines, which then drain straight into a water body. So they should just be carrying surface water, so runoff after rainfall. But actually you have these lines carrying sewage that are mistakenly connected to them. and they're then providing a constant input of fecal pollution into the system. It can also be indicative of failing infrastructure. So that could be sewage infrastructure, it could be private sewage systems such as septic tanks. Um, and because of this evidence of these point sources of pollution under wet and dry weather, we believe that these sites will be more likely to respond to investigation to identify these specific sources of pollution, and we can therefore then support the remediation of this so that there can be a positive benefit to gain. So we can identify the source of pollution and then help in remediating that to see benefits for the health of the river overall. So to shine a quick spotlight on the River Hems, which is one of the tributaries that has evidenced itself to be a system under real pressure. As I've mentioned, we see across a number of sites that we've been monitoring on the Hems, as well as additional sites that the Environment Agency was monitoring last bathing season, this evidence of elevated dry and wet weather concentrations of E. coli. So the River Hems has a number of sewage assets that sit within its catchment. So this is things like sewage treatment works, pumping stations, and the combined sewage overflows. So these will be placing pressure on the system. And what's important to note here is that the assets sitting on the River Hems, so the Southwest Water infrastructure on the River Hems, is not currently linked to Steamer Quay bathing water quality. So there's a regulatory system that links certain sewage infrastructure to bathing water quality, usually within a smaller radius of the bathing site. And these sites are not currently linked, which means there's not such an allocation of investment and investigation into these assets. But the data that we've gathered suggests that these assets are having an impact on downstream water quality, and we believe this impact is being seen as far downstream as Steamer Quay. In addition to this, the River Hems is surrounded by a lot of agricultural area, so you do have additional agricultural inputs coming into the system. And this year, last year in 2025, the Environment Agency conducted some microbial source tracking investigations, which is basically a method where you can take a water sample and analyze it to give you an idea of where the fecal pollution is coming from. So you can attribute a certain amount to human sources, to agricultural sources, to birds, for example. The caveat of this is the MST or microbial source tracking results show you the snapshot on that given day at that given site, but it gives you an idea of the pollution pressures being faced by the system. And the results from the Environment Agency's MST investigations confirm this combination of human and agricultural inputs. So it's highlighting the fact that the River Hems is under multiple pressures that are impacting the water quality that our monitoring has evidenced. So moving on now to Maltmill Lake, which feeds into Totnes upstream of the Steamer Quay bathing site. And this is not one that we were monitoring last year, but it's one that the Environment Agency was monitoring throughout the bathing season. And we've analysed their data alongside our own to understand what's going on in this tributary. And the data is suggesting high baseline E. coli levels under wet and dry weather conditions. And like with the Hems, the Environment Agency conducted some microbial source tracking investigations. This was only on one sample, but on that given day from that sample, the MST results suggested a really strong human signal, much stronger than the agricultural signals for this tributary, which is suggestive of pipe misconnections or failing private sewage in the catchment, which are contributing this human fecal pollution into the river. And so we feel that this represents a really clear opportunity for improvement, because if we can work to identify these sources of pollution and then help with the mitigation of this and the remediation of this, we believe that we'll see downstream benefits, for example, at Steamer Quay bathing site, which sits just downstream of Maltmill Lake. So that's why Maltmill Lake will be a priority for us moving forward. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about the Stoke Gabriel bathing site and the Yalberton stream, which is the stream that feeds into the Millpool. So, as I mentioned before, Stoke Gabriel for 2025 was given the classification of poor by the Environment Agency based on their monitoring data for the 2025 bathing season, and it was sufficient in 2024. So we've seen this deterioration of water quality at this site, and the data that the Environment Agency gathered on the Yarberton stream and at Stoke Gabriel showed very high levels of bacteria at Poor Park, which sits further upstream on the Yarberton stream, and an additional monitoring point further downstream near to where the Yarberton stream joins Millpool showed some evidence of dilution of this bacteria, but the levels remained elevated. And again, the EA conducted some microbial source tracking, and this indicated persistent sources of human sewage contamination. So again, the evidence is suggesting these consistent sources, which could be failing Southwest water infrastructure, it could be pipe misconnections, but it's believed that this poor water quality within the Yarberton stream could be contributing to the poor water quality that's been evidenced by the Environment Agency at the Stoke Gabriel bathing site. I wanted to take a quick moment here as well to talk about the classification of poor at Stoke Gabriel. Whilst it seems like a bad thing that it's gone from sufficient to poor, and of course this is a sign that water quality has got worse here, it highlights the power that having sites designated as bathing sites and recognised by DEFRA as a bathing site can bring. So when a site is given the classification of poor, it means that the Environment Agency has to carry out investigations to identify the sources of pollution and then work to remediate them. And this work must be done to ensure that the bathing site classification goes from poor to sufficient within 5 years. So it highlights how having this greater knowledge base of water quality and having the Environment Agency monitoring these bathing sites and where we're seeing these overall classifications of poor, it means that they're then focusing their resources and their investigative capacity on these sites to identify the sources of pollution. So we hope that with this focus on Stoke Gabriel and Yarberton Stream, we will see improvements in water quality at the Stoke Gabriel bathing site. So just to quickly summarise the key learnings that we've taken from our phase 3 monitoring. So the data that we gathered in 2025 has given us this really robust understanding of the baseline levels of fecal pollution across the wider Dart catchment. And this has enabled us to create a data set to enable us to support prioritisation of certain tributaries that we now have the evidence to show are contributing elevated bacterial levels to the main river. So it's helped us understand where we want to focus our resources and our investigations. And it's given us the confidence to move from this more wide-scale monitoring approach to understand levels of pollution across the catchment to a much more investigative approach to start to identify these sources of pollution and work with regulators and stakeholders to then remediate them, as well as providing a strong evidence base to engage with the EA and support their investigations and also highlight certain areas that we feel they should be focusing investigations on. So now that we're in 2026, we have transitioned to our phase 4 monitoring plan. And this is underpinned by our belief that long-term river health depends on transparency and accountability, and that this is underpinned by robust long-term data. So within our phase 4 monitoring, we aim to maintain these long-term data sets at key community use sites. So these are the community designated sites, which are Holnweir, Dartington Beach and Dartington Pontoon, as well as the designated bathing sites, Steamer Quay, Stoke Gabriel, Dittisham and Warfleet Creek, outside of the bathing season. So we feel it's really important to have these long-term data sets so that we can understand water quality at these sites and track changes throughout the year. And this data set and the sharing this in an open access format will improve confidence and decision making for people using the river. So we want to empower members of the community who love the river and who interact with the river to understand what's going on in the river and how water quality is changing throughout the year, not just within the bathing season, but year round. And we also aim to support the planned regulatory investigations that the Environment Agency has made for the 2026 bathing season with targeted evidence. So we'll be doing these targeted investigations in the months outside of the bathing season to support when the Environment Agency then conducts their own investigations, where they're focusing a lot of their investigations on the Stoke Gabriel area, as well as the Hems and Maltmore Lake. And in doing this, we hope to protect the bathing waters by understanding what drives poor classifications at Steve McKee and now Stoke Gabriel as well. And in doing this, this will benefit the health of the river overall by understanding where these pollution pressures are and what we can do to address them. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, this year we'll be focusing on bathing waters outside of the bathing season, as well as the community designated sites, with the addition of our investigative tributaries, our priority tributaries, which are the Hems, Maltmore Lake, and the Stoke Gabriel catchment. And we'll be introducing specific sewage testing around specific sewage treatment works and pumping stations, which I'll talk in more detail about on the next slide. But the map on the right here just shows the 30 sites that we plan to monitor in 2026 as part of our phase 4 monitoring programme. So as I mentioned, we'll be conducting upstream, downstream testing of specific sewage assets. These are Broadhempston, Ipplepen and Denbury sewage treatment works, as well as Torbryan pumping station. So these assets all sit on the River Hems, which our data from 2025 has shown to be a problem tributary. It has these consistently elevated E. coli levels. And we've chosen these assets to test above and below because these are assets that are not currently linked to water quality at Steve McKee bathing site, but we believe that these are having an impact on downstream water quality. So by collecting data on the E. coli levels above and below the assets, we're creating this evidence base to encourage the inclusion of these assets within the WINEP plans, which is basically creating these drivers for South West Water to invest and allocate more resources to improving these assets. In addition to this, we will be investigating point sources of pollution by conducting walkovers of the Hems and Maltmore Lake, and this will be done in collaboration with the Environment Agency. And the walkovers are a really brilliant way of investigating point sources such as pipe misconnections. So we'll basically go along these tributaries and sample just downstream of different surface water lines to investigate whether these surface water lines might have a sewage line mistakenly connected to them. And where we find evidence of these, we can then raise a national incident report, which is basically a regulatory way of presenting the evidence to South West Water, who are then obliged to investigate the misconnections and solve them, and so to remove the misconnections. So they're a really powerful way of identifying the sources of pollution, and then we can support the Environment Agency with taking the regulatory steps to mitigate them. And then the additional monitoring in Stoke Gabriel, so this is in response to the classification now of this site as poor, as well as our analysis of the Environment Agency's data. So we have introduced additional monitoring sites around Stoke Gabriel. So we will now have an additional site just upstream on the main river. So the Stoke Gabriel bathing site sits within the estuary right by the mill pool, but we've got an added site that sits just upstream of this and more in contact with the main river. And in addition to this, we will be sampling the mill pool and a couple of the tributaries feeding into the mill pool, as well as the Yalberton stream. So by adding these monitoring sites, we will be able to collect the data to start to understand where the key pressures are on the Stoke Gabriel bathing site. So what does this all look like in practice? We have now around 30 sites which we will be monitoring. This will be constantly reviewed as we get new data, and we are very responsive to as the data comes in. So at present, we have these 30 sites, but it will be constantly under review. And again, we'll be collecting samples under both dry and wet weather conditions to understand how the water in these sites is responding to wet weather events alongside what the baseline levels of E. coli are at these sites. And in addition, this year, we will be taking samples under different tidal conditions at the tidal sites. So we are really interested in how water quality is changing at these sites under different tidal conditions. So will we see water quality that's poorer when the tide is lower because there is less dilution of pollution events? At present, we don't have the data to answer those questions, but by gathering data at different tidal conditions at these sites, we'll be able to start answering questions like these. We'll be continuing to use Petri films to monitor E. coli, but continuing with our quarterly lab validations. So these are basically where we take a sample and half of it is analysed by Petri film in our in-house lab, and then half is sent to an accredited lab for traditional culture analysis. And then by gathering these paired samples, we can validate the Petri film method for understanding E. coli concentrations within the dart. And as always, we will continue sharing our data in an open source format. So our raw data is available on our website alongside the plots for each site, which show changes over time. And we'll be writing sampling reviews each week in our Facebook group and on our social media, and also writing monthly roundups of our sampling and what we've found in our monthly newsletter. And I just wanted to mention here the tributaries that we were monitoring during phase 3 that are not haven't currently been included in our phase 4 plans. These are the tributaries where the evidence suggests these lower baseline levels with these rainfall-driven spikes. So the Ashburn and Mardle rivers, as well as the Harborne. So whilst these are not currently incorporated into the phase 4 plan, investigative testing will be taken up on these rivers following a review of capacity and resources. So we'll roll out phase 4 and then we'll assess the capacity that we have to begin investigating these sites additionally. And so to step back a little bit, why does this all matter? Why does collecting all of this data matter? It matters for the river as well as for our communities. So we believe that with better evidence, we can create stronger accountability and transparency. We are an evidence-led organisation, and so by collecting this really strong evidence of water quality within the catchment, we then have a stronger voice to advocate for the river and place pressure on polluters so that we can see positive changes happening, which is all part of working towards the long-term ecological health of our river for the benefit of the environment as well as our communities. And in addition to this, by creating this really strong evidence base, we are empowering ourselves and our communities to make informed requests for national policy change. So it feeds into the work that we do, not just on a local level, but on a national level as well. I'm going to now pass back on to Hannah, who's going to talk about different ways that you can get involved with the work that we're doing. But thank you for listening, and I really hope that that was informative and interesting for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliza. Yeah, some really interesting questions popping up here too. Yes, so ways that you can get involved. I mentioned in the introduction that we're creating a Riverlong Ambassadors program, and we're looking at the moment, we're working to get that project funded at the moment. And once it's funded, we will have ambassadors in each parish along the whole river. So if you're keen to get involved in the Ambassadors project, then please do get in touch. There'll be an email on the next slide. We're also welcoming businesses to get involved as to donate and to sponsor an element of the project. Our funding all comes from donations. We're a grassroots organisation, predominantly voluntary. So if you're a business and you want to get involved, then please do get in touch. Businesses have supported us in lots of different ways, providing venues for events, or contributing financially, or supporting us with use of their boats, or all kinds of different things. You can also become a supporting member and donate monthly. So we really, yeah, we need everybody to get involved to help progress this work and move things forwards. We've already achieved an enormous amount. Yeah, we're an extremely determined, tenacious team, And yeah, I'm very, very grateful for all of the volunteers who contribute their time and energy. And we are seeing tangible outcomes. Um, so it's very exciting, and it's inspiring also to see what we can create when we come together. If you have a specific skill that you think we might benefit from, please do get in touch. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. In particular, we're in need of a volunteer to handle our social media. So if that's something you love doing, do contact me. Sign up for the newsletter, share our work. The power of this work is in the community. So we're community driven, and when we have all these voices working together, we can create change. So now we are going to take some questions, and I will hand over to Rob um, to moderate the questions for us.
Very much, Hannah. I think we've been having a good discussion in the chat. I think we've probably responded to the comments there, but please, anybody that would like to jump in, either post your question in the chat or just raise your hand if you're familiar with how to do that on Zoom. If you're not, then just unmute yourself and speak up, and we'll take your questions now, please.
Hi, I've just got a comment actually. It's Gemma rather than a question, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Gemma.
Hi, so we swim at Wharfleet on the bottom of the Dart, if everyone's obviously familiar with that. And we also swim around the corner at Castle Cove and Sugary. And what we've noticed, obviously anyone that works at the Dart knows there's a huge tidal range there. And so we've had in December some really big moons and some really large tides. And of course, that has offset the very wet winter we've had so far. But it's just anecdotal evidence from us swimming. But when it's really low, so we've got low tides, obviously associated with those big moons as well. The water quality is awful, just from a visual point of view. That's partly obviously to do with the rain and the wet weather events, but also the fact that during those sort of very big lunar events, you have really low water on the low tide. Um, so yes, I'm hoping that when you do that data on the tidal range, the tidal data, you'll come up with some interesting information on that. But we've seen the sort of difference ourselves just by looking at the water there.
No, thank you for sharing that, Gemma. I think this illustrates why the ambassadors program is so critical. If we're able to have kind of, local groups of people like you that can be sharing this kind of information in a much more regular and structured way, then we're going to be able to make a lot more progress. But thanks for sharing that. Anybody else like to come in?
If I could ask, well, first of all, thanks for some absolutely great and awesome work. But I would wonder if what your communication with the Southwest Water has been like, and how it's going forward, and how they're engaging.
Would you like to take that one, Hannah?
Yes. So we had a very, very positive beginning. We worked really hard at building relationship with Southwest Water, which was really important to us. We see it as, in order to all move forwards together, we need to get everybody around the table. Um, as things have progressed, we now have less contact with them, although we've had some really positive, tangible outcomes from pulling legislative levers, such as the bathing water, um, prompting investigations, as Eliza described. Um, yeah, we're reviewing ways that we can engage with Southwest Water to further move things forwards. But generally, when we meet individuals one to one, we find that everybody cares about the river and wants to remedy these problems. And actually, our focus then has gone more to um, working on getting policy changed at a national level, because ultimately that's what they're referring to. So the recent Office of Environmental Protection report We're just about to publish a blog on that actually, so look out for that. But that kind of progress is really positive because that's what the water company will respond to. Yeah, but we will keep those channels of communication open and take action where we can and where we feel it's best use of our time.
We've had one. Yeah, please go ahead. What that is.
I've just got a question about the so that I read last year that the Manchester and Liverpool Ship Canal won a kind of a landmark case in the High Court, which said that they could sue the water undertaker for polluting what was effectively their property. And I wondered if that would have any impact on the Dart. So the owner of the riverbed of the Dart, which is the Duchy, I believe, could put any pressure on South West Water if it turns out that they are one of the main contributors.
Anna, any thoughts on that?
Yes. Yeah, so that was a really interesting case. Yeah, and kind of forging the way. I'm I'm not sure that in this instance that would be helpful. It is something that we've considered, and in fact, we looked at forming a legal contract with Southwest Water that would move us towards resolving their pollution issues. We got as far as heads of terms, and at that point, the legal representative for Southwest Water wouldn't take it any further. But yeah, we were very keen to put something in place that would document a very clear timeline for resolution. So we're open to ideas, but we're keen to really invest in things that we feel will have a tangible outcome for the river. We're always referring back to, is this actually going to help the river, or is it a media campaign? A media campaign also is very beneficial, obviously. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, I think. I suppose, questioning whether the Duchy are actually involved in any of your work, whether they've expressed any kind of interest.
Yeah.
I
So
know that the Dart Harbour Authority are interested, but it's whether the Duchy themselves are.
yes, I am in contact regularly with the Duchy, and we're progressing conversations to see how we might partner together. Nothing yet is set, but I'm definitely working on that.
Thank you.
We've
Hi
got a
there.
question.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Sophie. I was going to pick up on a question in the chat, but please, you come in.
I just had a couple of questions, really, or thoughts. Is the focus of the group of the Friends of the Dart purely about water quality, or is it about other issues like access to riverbanks and things like that? And the other thing I was just wondering was whether there's any mechanism for people to report being ill, um, which I realise is probably scientifically not very reliable because you'd be relying on people to self-report and to, they could well be ill because they hadn't been in the river. But yeah, I just was wondering if that's something that you do as well.
So our focus is very much keeping the river at the center. So river health and ecology at the center of what we do. Um, yeah, I mean, human health comes into that, but our focus always comes back to river health because when you've got river health, everything else works. Um, yeah, and your second question, yes, we're working on a way of doing that reporting, but as you say, it's complex because, if somebody becomes sick, they may have swum in the river 24 hours before, but there's not necessarily an evidence trail of that causing illness. The whole project actually began because illness was being reported amongst swimmers. In large numbers over lockdown, and that prompted the question of what's in the water. And what we realized is that evidencing what's in the water is something that we can use to create accountability and therefore to create actual physical changes in the pollution levels that are going into the river.
We've got a question in the chat from Peter Waite asking about any comments on Dart Harbour advice not to swim above Gurard Point. Any comments you want to make on that, Hannah?
Yes, so Dart Harbour Authority are following the Environment Agency's downgrading of Stoke Gabriel, and yes, covering themselves. I mean, there is poor water quality detected there, and when you have poor water quality based on the EU Water Directive, that indicates that it's not safe for human contact. Obviously, those samples are taken at a specific time on a specific day, so it's impossible to, other than do an actual test that's, a live test, it's impossible to tell whether it's safe. Yeah, so I think as a general rule, they're working on that evidence of it being downgraded.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead, Anna.
Please go. Yeah.
I have to say, phenomenal work. It's considering this is just a group that came together, a few years ago. It's just thorough and so impressive. Anyway, I'm blown away, and I'm sure many are. Really, it's a very gentle question about your relationship with the EA and Southwest Water. I mean, it sounds like they're listening and you're working together and solution led and productive, etc. Any obstacles you've come across?
So, thank you for your comment, Anna. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
Yes, obstacles that we've come across. We've worked, so we really invested a lot of time and energy in talks with Southwest Water, and in coming to this potential legal agreement. And yeah, when it came to it, the obstacle was their the corporate focus, really on not on where they invest their funds, I guess. So when it got to the point of their solicitor reviewing it, their legal team weren't willing to take that any further. Whereas I think there really was, so our initial meeting with Susan Davey that Rob and I attended, where Susan came to the river, she said to us very clearly she'd like to see the progression to the point of resolution of them polluting into the River Dart. And our follow up on that was, okay, great, we'll take you at your word and let's put this in writing. So there's an awful lot of goodwill, but not a lot of follow through. And yeah, we're really keen to see what's possible. The conversation then was around, let's create a model for, a new way that a water company could work with the river, where it's really respecting this resource. And we're very open to that happening. Our relationship with the EA has grown over the years as they've seen our how thorough and evidence-based we are, and that our that our data is gold standard and stands up against scrutiny. So yeah, we've built a very positive relationship with them, and it's really helpful to be able to do things like walkovers with them and feed into what they can then go on to challenge. If a problem's found, they can go on to take action.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We've had some great questions there. We're at time. I think if anybody has any sort of burning last question, we could probably take it. Otherwise, I think we'd invite you to reach out to us. You can see our email there. You can find us on a range of different social media. And of course, we'd love to have you be involved in the Ambassadors Program if you'd like to. You can also sign up to our newsletter on the website where you'll get monthly updates. So thank you very much for joining us. I think we really appreciate your support. We can't do this without you being behind us and supporting us in a number of different ways. So thank you for joining us tonight and for your continued support. We really depend and appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Until next